So let's hit the record button. Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. My name is Carrie Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'm very excited to have you in class today. Today, we're going to dive deep into the principles that built up and are a part of the United States Constitution. So we're going to look at the time period from 1776 to 1787 and dive into those principles, explore how they work, and what brought us to that moment. Now, with this, we are so excited because we have one of our top scholars, Tom Donnelly, with us today. Tom, want to say hi to all the students before we get started?
Hello, everyone. Great to have you here.
So we are excited. There's a lot to go through. We have a whole bunch of principles to go through, but we want to remind everybody that we love questions and we love group sharing in the chat. So if you have a clarification or an idea or an example or a question, put it in the chat as we go along, and feel free to share it to everybody because we find it's such a great community of conversation going on in the chat as well as our class. So ask away, and we'll start with some questions for Tom directly. So here's our base framing questions. So easy first one. Why did the founding generation decide to write a constitution in the first place? We're at 1776. We got the Declaration. Why did they decide to write it? That leads us to the next question is, what are we living under as a government structure at that time? And tell us more about the Articles of Confederation. And then what were some of the lived experiences that the founders had in that time period of the revolutionary times to the writing of the Constitution that helped build out these principles to know what would be their best attempt at creating a new government structure? And then always our favorite story is Shays Rebellion. So Tom, you have to talk about great storytelling. We want you to tell that story today. And then just the idea, then walk us through all those principles that we have. So a lot on your docket today, Tom, per usual. So do you want to dive in and get started with a big idea?
That sounds great, Curry.
Awesome. There you go. Go nuts.
So when we're thinking, those are obviously humongous questions. And I mean, I think the one thing to keep in mind about this entire period is that the founding generation, the founders themselves, they were children of the Enlightenment. And by this, we simply mean that they believed in the power of reason. They believed in the value of looking to history. They believed in the value of looking to their lived experiences. And through all of those things, they believed they could bring those all together, exercise reason, and create a better world, and in their case, a better government. And so as we're thinking about the challenges facing them, we're going to really be telling the story from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitutional Convention. And between that period, it was a great period of experimentation for the founding generation. We lived under a new national framework of government, the Articles of Confederation, but we also lived under 13 separate state constitutions. And so as the framers were putting together the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention, they were looking to the articles, they were looking to the state constitutions, they were trying to draw lessons together to establish a new national government, one that was more powerful than the one established by the Articles of Confederation, but also one of limited powers.
That's a tall order in a short period of time. So 1776, the Declaration of Independence happens, before that the war begins. And we're living under the Articles of Confederation. So talk to our students about what that is and what year was that initiated?
So yeah, the Articles of Confederation, it's crafted by folks in the national government. Most notably, John Dickinson was one of the primary draftspeople, and it's emerging in 1781. So it's a little bit after the Declaration of Independence itself. We're creating this framework of government, and in many ways, what we're trying to write down is what we were already doing as a Congress during the Revolutionary War. So it was a way of just sort of putting in place a formal structure to formalize what we were already doing. And so the thing to remember about this period is, one way to look at it is we're learning a bunch of experiences from experiments of what we don't want to do with the new Constitution. So we often see the flaws in the articles, we see the flaws in the state constitutions, and we'll tick through those. But more broadly, we should understand this as one of the exciting moments in all of American history. From someone like John Adams's perspective, he would say it's one of the great moments in world history. We're creating a new nation. We're coming up with new frameworks of government. We're dreaming of what government can look like, and we're writing it down at the national level and in state constitutions. So I want to at least capture the drama and excitement of the moment before we get into some of the critiques. And so after putting that on the table, let's start with the Articles of Confederation. This is the framework of government that's in place already before we have the US Constitution. The one big thing, if you just want to remember one thing about the Articles, it's that it was a weak form of government. We created a weak national government. This shouldn't come as a surprise. We had just, we conducted a revolution against a powerful and distant government in Great Britain, a king. And so we didn't want to just get rid of the British Empire and then have a new distant, powerful national government with power moving away from the people in the states and into a consolidated political elite. So we created this Articles of Confederation to be a league of friendship. In many ways, what it is, the way to think about it, is it was a lot more like the United Nations today than the United States of America. Americans, in many ways, during this period, are more connected to their states than they are together as one nation. But the Articles of Confederation, therefore, it's trying to figure out a way we could still coordinate, even while we maintained a great level of state power and state independence. And so structurally, what we end up having is we have a Congress. The Articles of Confederation, the national government, basically is a Congress. It's a single house. It's a single Congress. And so, unlike our Constitution that we have today, there's no separate House of Representatives and Senate. Instead, it's just a single Congress. There's also no separate national executive branch. There's no separate national judicial branch. So here it really is all power gravitating towards a single house, Congress. And then within Congress, power itself is distributed equally to each state. So each state, no matter its population, receives one vote. They have the same amount of power, whether it's a really populous state, a big state like Virginia, or a very small one like Connecticut. So that's the structure. But even within that structure, we're not giving this new national government all that much power. The national government here under the Articles of Confederation, it can't tax. It can't regulate commerce between the states, which means it doesn't have a great role to play in shaping the economy of the early United States. And then what we also have, the government does not have the power to ask states to raise troops to build the national military. It can't even, again, because it doesn't have the power to tax, it can't even force states to send along money to pay for the government. So it really is in many ways a very weak national government. And the last thing to note here is that even though we could see all of these flaws, and the founding generation very quickly saw these flaws, that within the Articles of Confederation, the amendment process, if we wanted to change this framework, if we wanted to learn from this experience, it required a unanimous vote of the states. Every state had to agree to an amendment, and you can imagine how often that happened, Curry.
I love the sarcasm in that statement. So that's really helpful. So the two kind of framings that we're going to look at before we go into the principles is what was going on before the Constitutional Convention at the national level. You just spelled that out really well. And now we're going to dive into what was going on at the state level. And I love the way you said that earlier, Tom, that we're looking at the flaws to learn from them. Because as they're doing in 1776 to 1787, it's a lot of invention and innovation in government. And that is a messy process. So as long as you can learn from the messes and not repeat them, then it's a successful process. So let's dive into those states. Tell us what was going on in the states and who seemed to be doing the best job of all the states.
Yeah, so it's this exciting moment. Remember, at colonial times, we do have colonial governments. They're tied to the British Crown, the British Empire. But once we have a revolution, these royal governments crumble. And the new the national leaders then call on the states, state by state, to create new frameworks of government. So even before we have the Constitutional Convention and the US Constitution, we have this amazing moment of constitution making. We as Americans commit to writing down our constitutional ideas on paper. We commit to written constitutions state by state. And as we're doing this, we're drawing on old ideas from the British Constitution and from political theory at that time. And so the idea is that we really want within these governments to balance three sources of power. So if we think back to the British Empire, it's sort of a separation between what they would have said, the one, the few, and the many. So looking back at the British Empire, the one would be the king, the few would be the elite that ran the House of Lords, and the many would be the part of the government that's closest to the people, the House of Commons. So as the state constitution makers are coming up with their new frameworks of government, they're creating governments that distribute power between these three bodies. So for the one, they're creating what we would call today, and they call in most cases governors. So that's the executive branch of these governments. They also have an upper house of the state legislature representing the few, which we would call the Senate, and then one representing the many, which in many states they would refer to this as a state assembly. And so in these early state constitutions, if you were to look at them and say, what's the main quality you would find of them? You would say nearly all of these state constitutions put the most power in the lower house of the state legislature, in that state assembly. So what they're trying to do is, as opposed to having a powerful elite or a powerful king or executive, they're saying what we learned from the revolution and from our experience under the British Empire is we want to bring government as close as possible to the people. We want to put the most power in our state governments, in the part of that government, the lower house of the state legislature, the assembly, that's closest to the people, that has the most representatives, that has the closest connection to what the people want. And so we have this wave of state constitutions with very powerful lower houses of the state legislatures. But as we're moving from 1776 up until the Constitutional Convention in 1787, that crucial, just a little bit more than a decade, we're learning lessons from these experiences under these state constitutions. And many people are critical of these constitutions putting too much power, too much faith in a single part of the government, the lower house of the state legislature, these state assemblies. And they start arguing that we need more checks in place within these governments. One of the important voices here is John Adams. He writes this famous pamphlet, Thoughts on Government, where he's trying to lay out some advice for people as they're putting together these new constitutions. And he asks a really important question, and that's it's state constitution makers. How do we write a constitution that strikes the right balance between the one, the few, and the many? For Adams, this all comes back to the fact that Adams is critical, or he's sort of skeptical of the ability of any branch of government to get it right. He knows that every branch of government thinks it's the most wise. Every branch of government will say it's closest to what the people want. But in the end, Adams believed that everyone was flawed. Humans were flawed, but each branch of government was flawed as well. So Adams urges us to take some of those powers away from the lower part of the lower house of the state legislature and try to put them elsewhere. And John Adams himself puts pen to paper and helps write the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. And in many ways, this becomes the most celebrated constitution of this period. And what Adams is trying to do is learn from the experiences under the other state constitutions and create a framework of government that puts more checks in place. The big innovation, Curry, and this is the one thing to really remember, is that Adams puts in place a strong and independent executive. So the Massachusetts governor, two really big things there that weren't true of other state constitutions. One, the Massachusetts governor, he's elected directly by the voters. So in other states, the governor was linked to the state legislature. The state legislature chose the governor. Adams said, no. We need a governor that's independent of the state legislature. So you have independent power there. The other is that Adams gives the governor of Massachusetts a limited veto, which means that any piece of legislation passed by the state legislature has to come across the Massachusetts governor's desk, and the Massachusetts governor can say yes or no. And this is the ability to put another check in place if there's legislation that's unwise.
First of all, I think it's hysterical when you were hesitating to saying Adams was critical. It's in his nature. But I think it's so important because so often we talk about studying the state constitutions, and this is what the framing group at the convention are doing. They're studying these constitutions and looking at the experimentation that they did on this, and this Massachusetts Constitution as such an important one that they follow so many patterns from, but also learn from. When we think about this and we look at this as almost like the best case scenario, it doesn't really truly tell us what's going on in all of Massachusetts and across the country, because these can be great things that are coming out of it, but there's a lot of turmoil. And it's that turmoil and that danger of us falling apart completely that brings about the convention. And that's what leads us to Shays Rebellion. This is this case study on how things are falling apart and the urgency to need to fix that constitution and do something about it. So can you tell us kind of what's going on with Shays Rebellion, who Daniel Shay is, and why does it just spark such a culmination of great minds in Philadelphia in 1787?
Sure. So we're talking about it's late 1786, so it's a little over a decade after the Declaration of Independence. There's massive Revolutionary War debt. The state governments are each putting up trade barriers in place that make it difficult for the national economy to really function. The national government itself is struggling to raise money. It can't get the states to send it money, and so it can't pay soldiers. It can't pay the various parts of government to really keep it functioning. And so there's a sense among many people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, George Washington, that things are really falling apart. And so it's in this context, and in the context of a weak national government in the Articles of Confederation, that we get Shays Rebellion. And so this is an uprising in Massachusetts. It starts with Western farmers, farmers out west in Massachusetts. Their leader's Daniel Shays. Who's Daniel Shays? He's a 39-year-old veteran of the American Revolution. He fought at Lexington. He fought at Bunker Hill. And what these farmers, they're experiencing what a lot of Americans are experiencing at this moment. They're experiencing massive debt. They're experiencing high taxes. And they have a sense that their government, certainly they're not even thinking really about the national government, but they're thinking about their government, their state government in Boston isn't really hearing their voices. And so they take up arms, they march across Massachusetts, they close down courts, they close down debtors' prisons, they try to seize the state arsenal. And in the end, they want to find their way to Boston so they can really speak directly to the state legislature and say, hear us. And in the face of this uprising, the national government really can't do anything to respond. The national government has no power to raise a force of its own. It can't force states to send forces to the national government. And so who puts down this rebellion? It's a Massachusetts militia. And so Madison, Hamilton, Washington, they're horrified by this. And it's not just because Shays Rebellion itself was the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the world, but they're looking at it in context. They're saying, one, where is Shays Rebellion happening? It's happening in Massachusetts. This is supposed to be the government that's good. This is supposed to be the Constitution that works. And yet not even that one is working. And then there's this deeper sense that if we don't fix some of what ails the country and some of what's ailing these structures of government, if we don't maybe put a better national government in place, are there going to be more Shays Rebellions? Are we going to see more mob uprisings? And if we do, what are we going to be able to do about it? So there's this fear of things falling apart. And so you have people like Madison and Hamilton pushing for a new convention. And eventually they get Congress to call on for, quote, the sole and express purposes of revising the Articles. This would become the Constitutional Convention. And in many ways, apart from their intellectual contributions to the Constitution, for Hamilton and Madison, another of their great contributions is that they get that most important American of all standing there in the front of that room in that picture, George Washington, to show up at the Constitutional Convention, signaling that something really important is going to happen and that America really does need to change.
Huge energy, huge movement around it in the Americas. And we're going to dive now into the key principles underlying the United States Constitution. So students, you can start to read through those. But the World Cultures class is with us today in Grants Pass. Awesome to have you guys here. They've been studying the French Revolution, and tomorrow they're learning about the Declaration of Rights. Were the French an influence or influenced by American principles in this messy process of constitution making? Because I love this idea. So Miss McMillan or Teacher McMillan, thank you so much for asking this question. We talk so much about these influences of the states and what's happening in the state level and how it sets up these principles. Was it affecting other countries, and were their revolutions affecting us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a definite relationship there, and there's both a synergy in certain ways in which the two revolutions become quite different, as we all know. But certainly from the American perspective, they're looking back to many of the great political theorists of the Enlightenment. So Jean Locke, and that would be Jean-Jacques Rousseau as well. And so they're imbibing influences from European thinking. Of course, the French themselves play a key role in helping the Americans win their revolution. It's an important alliance that we have. Jefferson himself is in France. So, I mean, there's sort of an interplay of ideas. And furthermore, the principles that you see enshrined in those two key documents, the Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of Rights, you see a certain amount of overlap. So as a matter of principle, there's something going on where I think both societies are committed, again, to this project of reason and, in both cases, a move towards a republican form of government, at least initially in France. And so they're both sort of drawing from the same ideas from the Enlightenment and then learning from one another. And you end up, I think, the traditional way to look at the two, and you end up with a much more radical and convulsive revolution in France and sort of still a really transformational revolution in America, but the one that leads to greater stability more quickly.
Yeah, and now I want to have a whole class on revolutions and how their outcomes in democracies, but that's for next week. Great question. Real quick, as we dive into these principles, Fred asked, is there a reason why they just didn't fix the articles, even though because it was their sole purpose to amend and fix the articles, but they didn't. They took them, threw them out, and they started from scratch. Why didn't they attempt to do that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's the first conversation they have at the convention. When the convention starts, James Madison and the Virginia delegation show up with their own new plan of government, the Virginia Plan, which is a call for a new government and a much stronger national government. And the delegates have a conversation about, well, aren't we supposed to be here to revise the articles? But the background understanding here for all of the not for all of them, for almost all of the delegates, is that even people who end up opposing the Constitution thought the articles had problems. But everyone knew that the articles themselves, if they stayed within them, it would require unanimity to revise them in any way. And frankly, Rhode Island didn't even show up to the Constitutional Convention. So they just didn't think that within the framework that they had, and even the framework of amendment process that they had on the Articles of Confederation, that they could make them better. And so therefore they decided for a more decisive break, and they decided that very quickly. This isn't to say there were delegates, like the delegates from New York, Robert Yates and John Lansing, they left the convention eventually because they said, look, you're not listening to Congress. You're going beyond what Congress could say. The response from Madison and James Wilson and some of the important supporters of the Constitution was, you're right. We are, we're moving away from the articles. We're going beyond even what Congress said. But what we're doing here is we are proposing something new. We're not imposing a new government on the American people. In the end, we're going to root all of this in popular sovereignty, our first key principle here of the US Constitution, because in the end, it doesn't matter that we like this new Constitution. It doesn't even matter that the most famous Americans, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, put their name to it. In the end, it's up to the American people acting in state conventions, state by state, to say yes or no to this new document. So any technical problems there are under the articles or under our instructions from Congress, we can get around them, and we can completely cancel them if the American people are willing to say yes, because it's up to them.
I love that. Great weave, Tom. I'm just going to give you like a extra kudos for weaving that in. The right to revolution, the idea of popular sovereignty is mixed into chucking out the articles and writing a new constitution. So real quick, you have, again, 8 minutes to bang us through these big 5 key principles of the Constitution.
Sure. So popular sovereignty, it's just the fancy way of saying that we have, that the US Constitution establishes a government that's driven by us. So it's not a king, not the elites, not an aristocracy, but by us, the American people. It's based more broadly in social contract theory. So more broadly, it's the idea that all political power comes from the people. And when we establish a government, what we do is we take some of the power that's ours and we give it to a government. And this becomes an agreement between the people and their government. We give away some of our power, and the government then has a duty to serve our interests. It has a responsibility to, at the very least, as we said in the Declaration of Independence, ensure for our safety and happiness, to ensure that we really do receive our natural rights to be free and equal, and a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then within the principle of popular sovereignty is the idea that if the government breaks that contract, we have the power always to alter or abolish that government if it's not serving us in the way that the social contract that we made with the government suggests that it should. And this could be, because of tyranny. It could be that maybe the government just is tyrannical. It could be a lousy government. It could be a flawed government. And popular sovereignty allows us then this principle to either do really big things like revolution, or create a new constitution. So the American Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, or even smaller things like just passing new laws that we think serve our interests, or amend our framework of government, our Constitution, in ways that are conducive to our safety, happiness, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all of those key and important principles.
Awesome. Okay, so the power is rooted in we the people, popular sovereignty. That power through social contract theory is given to the government to use with the right of the people to take it back in any level that they want. And that brings us to then how is that power distributed by the country across the nation, across the national government, but also across national, state, and local governments. So that brings us, I think, nicely to federalism. So you want to start with federalism, and then we'll roll into its counterpart, separation of powers.
That's perfect, Curry. So all political power derived from the people, that's popular sovereignty. We see it in the preamble to the Constitution, those opening words, we the people. And so what do we do with that power in this new Constitution? We divide it in multiple ways. So this next key principle, federalism, simply means the division of power between the national government and the states. This was so important for the founding generation because remember, most Americans at the founding, they feel most closely connected to their states. And so the founders looked as they're constructing this new national government and said, we need to ensure that we keep a lot of the political power close to the government that's closest to the people. And that's the state government, that's their local governments. And so they will play a central role in shaping policy throughout the nation. Part of this is because even at the founding, we were a very diverse people. People from different states had very different sensibilities, very different preferences. And as a result, we wanted to give the states a lot of power to pursue different policies that they thought matched the interests and views of their people on everything from, how to regulate the economy to eventually things like education, et cetera. And so from the very beginning, there's this idea that political power is going to be divided between the national government, the states. There's no single federalism clause of the Constitution. So if you're looking for that word or that clause, it's not there. But once you look in the Constitution, you can see it's everywhere. And so just look at all of those. All of those provisions Curry has on the screen there are different parts of the Constitution that touch on this idea of federalism, the division of power between the national government and the states. One of the most famous expressions of the value of federalism comes in 1932 from Justice Louis Brandeis. When he referred to the states and their diverse pursuit of policy, they were the laboratories of democracy. And so here the idea is that if we give power and discretion and authority to the states, they're able to test out ideas on a smaller scale. And so over time, we as a people can learn from that experience. And so sometimes what that'll do is, the states will experiment with bold ideas. States can be bold. Those ideas will take off, they will work, and they will then spread like wildfire throughout the nation. One classic example of this is a women's right to vote. That began as a state experiment in Western states, and then state by state, more and more states adopted it, and that moved further and further east until big states like New York and Michigan granted women the right to vote. And eventually we decided it was such a good idea that we wrote it into the Constitution in the 19th Amendment. The flip side of this, and this goes to why we create a national government with national power, is that sometimes it's important to have a powerful national government to check the states. Maybe the states are being abusive. And so the national government has the power in certain areas to say, no, states, you can't do that. In America, we don't do it that way. And the classic example here would be something like the civil rights movement and the attack on Jim Crow. And so this is, you had state after state after Reconstruction imposing racial discrimination on African Americans. And it ultimately took the national government, it took obviously the American people working for decades upon decades in the civil rights movement to push for change, but it's eventually the national government in the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, and then Congress with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 saying, no, you cannot do this, and advancing civil rights for all Americans, applying nationwide. So you can have ideas bubble up, so a bottom up, new ideas taking off and seizing the nation, but sometimes the national government striking abuses in the states, so power from the national government down.
Fantastic. And looking at that balance of power and then the checks on it brings us perfectly to looking at the national government and how did they separate the power in the national government? Because the fear is always that one branch having too much power is dangerous. So separate and then overlap. So explain that to us a little bit more.
Exactly. Very quickly. So this is separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers simply speaks to the idea of the people take that power, give it to the national government, and then distribute it to different branches of government. So we end up with 3 branches of government. The legislative branch, which is Congress, makes the laws. The executive branch, led by a president, enforces the laws. And the judicial branch, headed by the Supreme Court, interprets the laws. It's a way of avoiding having too much power in any single branch of government. That's the separation of powers, dividing the powers of the national government between those three branches. Checks and balances speaks to the idea, though, that the founders also put in place a system where each branch of government would have power to check the other branches. And so the easiest way to see that is think about the lawmaking process in the United States. Congress is given the power to make the laws, but once Congress passes a law, it then goes to the president's desk. And the president has the power, if the president wants to veto that law, to cancel that law. The president has a choice to either sign the law and make it law, or say, no, veto it and throw it out. So the president has a check on what Congress does. But even if Congress passes a law, a president signs the law, there's still the possibility of individual Americans or groups or organizations going to court and arguing that that law is unconstitutional. And so we give the federal courts the power of judicial review to decide whether a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. That's a separation of power, separating power between these three branches of government, but checks and balances giving each branch of government the authority to check the other.
Yeah, a little overlap in the jobs too is important to make sure there's balance. Now, one topic that we talk about all the time, but we really don't explain clearly, in my opinion, is republicanism. So can you, we're not talking about the parties, we're talking about republicanism as an idea that our government and our structure is based off on. So can you give us a real quick wrap up on this one as well?
Absolutely. This is in many ways, one of the real animating principles for the founding generation. It has two main components. One is the simple component that there's an institutional part of it. So this is the idea of republicanism as a matter of governmental institutions, is the idea that the people need to be able to elect representatives that represent them within government. It's ensuring that whatever government you're putting in place provides a conduit from the people themselves and their preferences in the government. And this is usually done through elections. So it's just the idea of representative democracy in an institutional sense. That's, no king, but instead elected representatives. That's a simple institutional way of thinking about republicanism. But it was also a deep ethos for the founding generation. So they would have said that it's absolutely essential to the success of America that both American people and their representatives have what they would have called civic republican virtue. And so this is just a fancy way of saying that both the citizens themselves and their representatives had to commit to virtue, not vice, so to do good things and not bad things, but also commit to reason and not passion, and commit to the public good and not private self-interest. Because again, remember, the founding generation, they were looking back throughout history, they were looking back to classical antiquity, to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and what they saw was a few key lessons. One is that the people themselves, they're flawed, but also with that, because of that, republics are fragile. Republics often eventually fail, and so we need to constantly be on our guard for governmental abuses, governmental corruption, but we also have to look within ourselves. It's not just up to government officials. They're not the boss, we're the boss. And so as a result of that, we need to tend to ourselves. We need to ensure that we're committing to virtue. We need to ensure that we're taming our passions and committing to reason, and also tame our selfish interests and try to commit to the public good. Now they knew the system was, we're human beings, we're flawed. They were not like overly romantic people thinking that everything's great. In fact, the reason they preached civic republican virtue so boldly was precisely because they were concerned that republics inevitably fail, and they didn't want that to be the case in America.
Awesome, Tom. Thank you so much. That was a lot to go through, and you did a really good job getting it all in on time. So students, we are going to wrap up this class. We're going to hold for about 5 minutes for questions at the end. And if there's any clarification or questions, hang out with us. I'm just going to stop the official recording. So thank you all very much. If you need to jump now, we totally understand. So let me stop the recording. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Tom, so much. And the questions are coming in as well as the thank yous. So question from Fred, and he was talking about judicial review. And so where do we really see judicial review come up? And let me ask, judicial review was debated, but it was left out of the idea in separation of powers and checks and balances. Do we see the idea of judicial review coming from the Massachusetts state constitution? Do we see it in the Federalist Papers? Give us a little bit more about where that idea was generated, and do they really have it top of mind when laying out Article 3?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So there's no judicial review clause of the Constitution that we could easily point to. Also, if you read the records of the convention, they spent very little time on the judiciary. If you look at the Constitution itself, in Article 3 of the Constitution, they also say very little about what the federal judiciary is going to look like. In fact, they leave a lot of the details to what Congress wants to do in terms of everything from how many justices we're going to have to whether we're going to have other levels to the federal court system. So they really did punt on a lot of these details to Congress. Nevertheless, for the founding generation, the idea of judicial review was very much in the air at the Constitutional Convention. In Article 3, when they vested the judicial power of the United States in the federal judiciary, they would have, I think for most of them, they would have said, yeah, judicial review is a part of that. Because in the states, we already saw some experimentation in various states of sort of a weak form of judicial review. It's not sort of what we had today, where it seems to happen frequently and sometimes on really hot political topics. But you did see judges begin to exercise judicial review. In a lot of ways, these arguments extended all the way back to debates leading up to the American Revolution. So one of my heroes, the Massachusetts patriot James Otis, began to theorize about judicial review, during the colonial era. And in the end, you're seeing experimentation with judicial review around the Constitutional Convention. And then you see, both the anti-federalists, when they're arguing about the Constitution, very concerned that the national government's going to have this powerful judiciary that's going to run roughshod on the states. And then within the Federalist Papers, you see Alexander Hamilton, most famously in Federalist number 78, make a really strong argument about why judicial review is essential to the constitutional system. Mostly it's because it actually goes back to popular sovereignty. It's the idea that the Constitution is established by the American people. It is the most fundamental, it is supreme, as Article 6 of the Constitution says. And as a result, as judges take an oath of office and have to decide cases, one thing they have to decide is whether the law before them is consistent with the fundamental law of the land rooted in popular sovereignty, that is the Constitution. So judicial review there connecting back to that key principle of popular sovereignty, and of course also to checks and balances. It's a way of checking when maybe the Congress and the president or even the states run roughshod over key constitutional principles and constitutional limits. But it's a great question. It's one that scholars have debated for a really long time, just sort of how much the founding generation really thought judicial review would be central to the system, whether it was legitimate. And then more broadly, it does the way it functions today. Is it consistent with what they would have expected?
Awesome. Thanks, Fred. Okay, Alice, that's a great question. Has the guarantee in the Constitution of a Republican form of government for the states ever been invoked in a Supreme Court decision? Sorry, I was trying to read the shorthand, but it was good, Alex. Nice, thank you.
That's a great question. The Supreme Court decided in the 1800s that that particular clause of the Constitution is not enforceable in court. They say that they effectively said it's a political question, and as a result, it's sort of like a deep principle that's in the Constitution, but that courts are not going to be apt to realize. Nevertheless, it's important to remember that the Republican form of government clause, though it may be obscure to us today, was absolutely central to a lot of the arguments around both a lot of the anti-slavery arguments within the Republican Party leading up to the election of President Lincoln. And then with Lincoln and the Republican Congresses during the Civil War and Reconstruction, it was seen as a key justification for trying to reform the ex-Confederate states. So it was seen as a key source of authority. For one of my heroes, Charles Sumner, the great abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, would look to the Republican form of government clause and say that those governments being recreated in the South after the Civil War are not Republican. And so we, Congress, have the power to remake them in a Republican image and create them in a way that's consistent with what we think the Constitution means after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. So it becomes a really key constitutional principle in politics. And today it's one that people often draw on, even in the context of contemporary controversies like partisan gerrymandering, et cetera. You'll see both scholars, lawyers, and even I remember Justice Gorsuch probed that line of argument in one of the partisan gerrymandering cases in recent terms. So it's one that's sort of in the academic ether, even though the Supreme Court a long time ago said, don't use this clause, use other clauses.
That was Barbara's exact question. It's like you channeled her right there. So Barbara's question is basically like, we have this this devotion to republicanism, but we see gerrymandering. So what institutional checks or balances can work with that and can correct it?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what Justice Kagan said in her dissent in Rucho versus Common Cause. In the end, Chief Justice Roberts responded to it in the majority opinion there, saying that there are plenty of mechanisms state by state outside of, because I mean, remember, state governments don't function quite the same way as the national government. And so there are more direct popular inputs, say through referenda or things like that at the state level, that he thought could sometimes structurally check partisan gerrymandering if that's a concern in the electorate. But there was certainly a dividing line between the majority and the dissent in the Russo case a few terms ago.
Awesome. Now, students, I know everybody has to jump in a minute, so I'm going to try to wrap it really quickly. Now, Tom, because you're so much fun to ask questions too, there's a couple random questions, but they're great. So I'm going to real quick ask you, Fred wants to know, why was the word expressly left out of the 10th Amendment?
There's a lot of debate over that, but so if you want to, let me just first make a book recommendation and then answer it pretty quickly. If you want to know more about that debate, there's a book by Jonathan Gannap of Stanford called The Second Creation, where he talks a lot about early constitutional debates after the Constitution's ratified, and part of that is about sort of debates over the scope of national power. And so there's a lot of discussion about why expressly was in there or was not in there. The thought was, I think in part what the scholarship suggests is that it was a conscious choice because expressly was in the Articles of Confederation. And so they thought with the new national constitution that they didn't want to quite have, they were concerned about creating it in sort of like the same mirror image of the Articles of Confederation, so didn't necessarily want to parallel that language. Nevertheless, they thought that they had done enough to create a limited government through enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, that expressly was not really required. It just required typical construction of what those powers would mean. Anyway, it is a good question. It is, if you go back to the anti-federalists during the ratification debates, they were so angry expressly was not in there. And so it certainly comes up both in the state ratifying conventions, sort of like that, they would want that in a new amendment. And then later critics of the national constitution, but even of the 10th Amendment as it's constructed.
Awesome. Okay, last question, and I promise we'll wrap up. The founding fathers this is Greg, the founding fathers could not agree on the words they used in the Constitution, often intentionally to help drive consensus. So what are we to make of textual analysis? And I feel like this was our methods class just a few weeks ago, but really, so if you're using more general terms or more generic terms to build consensus and not overly define things, how does that work in opposition or in agreement with textual analysis?
Well, there's a great level of, so there are debates both at the interpretive level, but also at the empirical level over this. So there are scholars who would say, yes, the framers did that in certain circumstances, but there's enough of the Constitution that is determinate, that text and history do constrain us, and that there is sort of an underlying truth, or at least something an answer that's more probable than not.